In 1997, a team of researchers in Sydney conducted an experiment that quietly contradicted everything the medical establishment had been telling diabetic patients for a decade. They took two groups of people with type 2 diabetes. They fed both groups the exact same meal, identical ingredients, identical calories, identical portions of rice. The only difference was the order in which the food was prepared. One group's rice was cooked and served immediately. The other group's rice was cooked, refrigerated overnight, and reheated the next morning. Same rice, same person, same day, completely different blood sugar response. The group that ate the refrigerated and reheated rice showed a 40 to 50% lower blood sugar spike than the group that ate the freshly cooked rice. 40 to 50% from putting leftovers in the refrigerator. The researchers published their findings. The pharmaceutical industry noted it and moved on. Because there is no patent on a refrigerator, there is no profit margin on telling a diabetic patient to cook their rice the night before. And that is precisely why most people with diabetes have never heard this, despite the fact that this mechanism has now been replicated in peer-reviewed studies published in journals including Nature and Nutrients. Today at Eternal Vigor Way, I am a health researcher, and I am going to walk you through 6 specific, science-backed strategies that allow you to eat bread, rice, and potatoes. Foods you have been told to avoid, without the dangerous blood sugar spikes that damage blood vessels, exhaust the pancreas, and accelerate every chronic disease associated with diabetes. None of these strategies involve supplements. None of them require a prescription. All of them are grounded in published clinical evidence. Stay through all 6, because strategy 1, the final one, amplifies the effect of every other strategy on this list simultaneously, and it costs less than $1. Before the 6 strategies, the mechanism matters. When you eat a starchy food, bread, rice, potatoes, digestive enzymes in your small intestine break the starch down into glucose. That glucose enters your bloodstream, triggering an insulin response from the pancreas. Insulin signals your cells to absorb the glucose for energy. In a healthy metabolic system, this process is smooth and self-correcting. In a system with insulin resistance, which affects the majority of adults over 60 in the United States and Europe, the cells respond poorly to insulin's signal. The pancreas compensates by producing more insulin. Over time, this cycle exhausts pancreatic beta cells and progressively worsens glucose control. Here is the critical insight that most dietary advice misses. The speed of glucose entry into the bloodstream is as important as the amount. A slow, steady glucose release gives the pancreas time to respond proportionally. A rapid spike overwhelms the system regardless of the total glucose quantity. Every strategy in this video works by slowing that rate of glucose entry through different mechanisms targeting different points in the digestive process. Understanding the mechanism is what makes the strategy stick, because it transforms a rule you follow into a principle you understand. Most starch breaks down rapidly in the small intestine, releasing glucose into the bloodstream within 15 to 30 minutes of eating. Resistant starch behaves entirely differently. Your digestive enzymes cannot efficiently break resistant starch down. Instead of being absorbed in the small intestine, it travels intact to the large intestine, where gut bacteria ferment it. That fermentation produces short-chain fatty acids, particularly a compound called butyrate, that improve insulin sensitivity, reduce systemic inflammation, and feed the cells lining the colon wall. The remarkable finding from the Sydney research and from multiple subsequent studies is that you can transform ordinary starch into resistant starch through a simple cooking technique: cool it. When cooked starch is refrigerated for a minimum of 12 hours, a process called starch retrogradation occurs. The gelatinized starch molecules, specifically amylose chains, realign and form tightly packed crystalline structures. A study published in Nature found that cooling cooked rice at 4 degrees Celsius for 24 hours and then reheating it increased its resistant starch content from 0.64 grams per 100 grams to 1.65 grams per 100 grams, a 2.6-fold increase. Research published in the journal Nutrients showed that chilled potatoes reduced glucose spikes and insulin levels by over 20% compared to freshly cooked potatoes. The practical application is straightforward. Cook your rice, pasta, or potatoes the evening before. Refrigerate overnight. Reheat before eating. The texture changes slightly. The blood sugar response changes dramatically. For those who cannot always prepare food in advance, several foods are naturally high in resistant starch regardless of preparation. Beans, lentils, chickpeas, green peas, steel-cut oats, and pearl barley. Adding any of these to a meal that contains rapidly digestible starch blunts the overall glucose response of the entire meal. In real eating situations, carbohydrates are rarely consumed in isolation, and that is precisely where the opportunity lies. A comprehensive meta-analysis of over 150 clinical trials found that adding 25 to 30 grams of protein to a carbohydrate meal reduces the glucose area under the curve, the total glucose exposure, by up to 50% in healthy adults. The mechanism is threefold. Protein stimulates insulin secretion independent of glucose, improving the pancreas's ability to respond to the incoming carbohydrate load. Protein also slows gastric emptying. Protein slows the rate at which the stomach releases its contents into the small intestine, extending the glucose release window from minutes to hours. And protein activates incretin hormones that improve the efficiency of insulin signaling in muscle cells. Dietary fat contributes similarly. Fat delays gastric emptying and improves insulin clearance, which is why potatoes eaten with olive oil or butter produce a meaningfully gentler glucose response than potatoes eaten alone. Acid is the third pairing element, and the one most consistently overlooked. Vinegar, lemon juice, lime juice, and fermented foods like sauerkraut or kimchi inhibit the enzyme alpha amylase. This inhibits the enzyme responsible for breaking starch into glucose in the small intestine. This slows the rate of starch digestion at the source. Acetic acid, the active compound in vinegar, additionally improves insulin sensitivity in muscle cells and reduces hepatic gluconeogenesis, the process by which the liver produces new glucose between meals. The practical implication: never eat carbohydrates alone. Rice and beans together is metabolically superior to rice alone. Potatoes with grilled protein and a dressed salad is a fundamentally different metabolic event than potatoes on their own. This strategy requires no change in what you eat, only the order in which you eat it. A randomized controlled crossover trial published in the journal Diabetes Care examined what happens when people with type 2 diabetes eat the same meal in different sequences. One sequence, carbohydrates first; the other, protein and vegetables first. The results were striking. Eating protein and vegetables before carbohydrates produced a 73% lower peak glucose level at 30 minutes, a 40% reduction in the glucose spike, and 31% lower insulin levels. A separate study in Japan using continuous glucose monitors in healthy adults confirmed that eating rice last significantly reduced post-meal blood sugar excursions by up to 50%. The physiological explanation is elegant. When protein and fiber arrive in the stomach first, they stimulate the release of GLP-1 and other incretin hormones that slow gastric emptying and prime the pancreas before the glucose load arrives. The stomach then releases a slower, more controlled stream of mixed nutrients into the intestine. The glucose arrives gradually rather than as a surge. This is particularly relevant in restaurant settings. Bread, chips, and rolls are typically served before the main meal. Eating them first produces the sharpest possible glucose spike. Ordering a salad to start, eating the protein first, and finishing with the starch. Before the final 3 strategies, I want to stop here. What you have just heard is not the content of a standard diabetes education class. It is peer-reviewed clinical evidence translated into practical daily decisions. That translation, rigorous evidence into practical action for adults over 60, is exactly what Eternal Vigor Way publishes every single week. If you are not subscribed, do that right now before we continue. Strategy 1 is coming next. Here is a finding most people with diabetes are never told. The same meal produces a significantly different blood sugar response depending on what time of day you eat it. Research on circadian glucose metabolism has consistently found that insulin sensitivity peaks in the morning and early afternoon. It declines progressively through the evening. By late night, it is at its lowest point of the day. The same carbohydrate meal eaten in the evening produces a 15 to 20% higher glucose spike than the identical meal eaten at midday. The pancreatic beta cells become less responsive as the day progresses. Muscle cells become less sensitive. And elevated evening melatonin, the hormone that regulates sleep, further reduces insulin secretion by an estimated 40 to 50%. This is not a minor variable. It means the consequences of a bowl of rice at 7 p.m. are fundamentally different from noon. The practical guidance: concentrate carbohydrate consumption in the morning and early afternoon. Keep dinner lighter in carbohydrates. If carbohydrates are consumed at dinner, finish eating at least 3 hours before going to bed. Not all carbohydrates produce the same blood sugar response, and the difference is not primarily about sugar content. It is about the physical structure of the food and how rapidly digestive enzymes can access it. Think of it as the difference between kindling and logs in a fire. Fine white flour has been milled to a powder so fine that digestive enzymes can access every starch molecule almost immediately. Glucose floods the bloodstream within 15 to 30 minutes. Whole grains, intact kernels, and high-fiber carbohydrates behave like logs. Steel-cut oats, intact grain berries, black rice, wild rice, bulgur wheat. These foods take 2 to 3 hours to fully digest. The glucose enters slowly and steadily. The glycemic index data makes this concrete. White rice, glycemic index of 73, essentially no fiber. Brown rice, 68. Black rice or wild rice, 42 to 45. The same basic food category, rice, with a 40% difference in blood sugar impact. For bread, white bread carries a glycemic index of 75 with virtually no fiber. Sourdough bread has a glycemic index of 48 to 54. Sprouted grain bread carries a glycemic index around 36 and naturally contains resistant starch. For potatoes, standard russet potatoes have a glycemic index of 85 to 90. Sweet potatoes, 44 to 61, and the glycemic index of any potato can be reduced by approximately 40% simply by applying strategy 6. Cook, cool overnight, reheat. The final strategy is the one that amplifies every other strategy on this list, and it costs less than $1 per week. Acetic acid, the active compound in vinegar, inhibits the enzyme alpha-glucosidase. This is the same enzymatic mechanism targeted by the diabetes medication acarbose. By inhibiting this enzyme, acetic acid slows the rate at which starch is broken down into glucose, extending the digestion window and flattening the curve. The research on this mechanism is robust. Studies have found that consuming 1 to 2 tablespoons of vinegar before a carbohydrate meal reduces the spike by 20 to 35%. Acetic acid improves insulin sensitivity in skeletal muscle by up to 34%. The liver effect is equally significant. Consuming 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar before bed reduces fasting blood glucose the following morning by 4 to 6%, an effect comparable to some pharmaceutical interventions. A comprehensive meta-analysis published in Frontiers in Nutrition confirmed that consistent daily vinegar consumption produces significant improvements in both fasting blood glucose and hemoglobin A1C in people with type 2 diabetes. The practical protocol: dilute 1 to 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar or red wine vinegar in a large glass of water and drink it 10 to 15 minutes before your main carbohydrate-containing meal. Use it as dressing or marinade too. When vinegar is combined with the meal sequence strategy, starting with a vinegar-dressed salad, then protein, then finishing with carbohydrates, the synergistic effect produces outcomes that exceed what any single strategy achieves alone. One practical caution: always dilute vinegar before consuming. Undiluted acetic acid can damage tooth enamel and irritate esophageal tissue. Consult your physician if you have gastroparesis. The 6 strategies form a layered system. Used together, their effects compound. Before your meal, drink 1 to 2 tablespoons of vinegar diluted in water. This primes the system before food arrives. When preparing food, cook rice, pasta, and potatoes the evening before whenever possible. Refrigerate overnight and reheat. At the meal, never eat carbohydrates alone. Start with vegetables and protein, then carbohydrates last. After eating, walk for at least 10 minutes within 15 to 30 minutes of finishing the meal. Movement activates glucose uptake in muscle tissue through an insulin-independent mechanism. The soleus muscle is particularly effective. You do not need to implement all 6 simultaneously. Begin with 1 or 2. The meal sequence strategy and the 10-minute post-meal walk are the easiest entry points. Layer in the others progressively. The 6 strategies in this video are not experimental. They are grounded in randomized controlled trials, meta-analyses, and peer-reviewed research published in leading medical journals. They have been replicated across study populations, and yet the majority of people managing blood sugar have never encountered most of them. That gap is not an accident. It is the outcome of a healthcare system where a 7-minute appointment is the primary channel for information. Your blood sugar does not have to spike every time you eat bread, rice, or potatoes. The biology is on your side. The evidence is available. The strategies work. If this video gave you something you can use, you understand our mission. Every week, we translate research into practical guidance. Subscribe before you close this video, because next week we are covering the 5 minerals that are silently depleted in adults over 60, depletions that standard blood panels do not detect. This is Eternal Vigor Way. The information here is not a substitute for your physician's guidance, but it is the kind of evidence that makes every medical conversation more productive. Eat the rice, just prepare it right.